Welcome to PandaAudioBooks, the perfect place for a huge collection of fantasy novels. If you enjoy my content and want to support my work, a small contribution via PayPal is greatly appreciated. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell to stay updated with our latest audiobook chapters. Chapter 676, Spiritual Sense Formation. Fellow Daoist speaks the truth, but I have no intention of handing over my concubine. I merely wish to exchange a few pointers. Han Li spoke calmly and soon released his spiritual sense. With the appearance of an astonishing aura, something shot towards the Marquis. Good. Marquis Nanlong appeared completely calm and released his spiritual sense. Two streaks of nearly incorporeal force appeared between the two and burst in a collision. A violent gust suddenly appeared and blew out in every direction. Marquis Nanlong felt alarmed by the development as his initial spiritual sense probe instantly grew several times greater in size. Layers and streams of violent white instantly flew into the gap of space between Han Li and the Marquis, causing their silhouettes to blur as if there were two originless and unmoving shadows. Spiritual sense formation. How can this be? How is junior martial brother Han's spiritual sense so strong? Lu Luo couldn't help but cry out in disbelief. Spiritual sense formation? Could my lord win? I'm not sure either, but ordinarily, spiritual sense formation is a divine ability only mid-nascent soul cultivators can grasp. For junior martial brother Han to be able to use this technique, his main cultivation art must be specialized in spiritual sense. That is the only possible explanation. Lu Luo's excited words turned into a pensive mutter halfway through. Filled with hope by her martial ancestor Lu's explanation, Mu Peeling said, "In that case, my lord must have a fighting chance." With a shifting expression, Lu Luo said, "That's hard to say. There are differences in strength among even similar grade cultivators. Marquis Nanlong had already entered the mid-nascent soul stage 300 years ago. Although his progress has stalled, he is without a doubt only a step away from late nascent soul stage. It should be quite difficult for junior martial brother Han to win against this old eccentric." When Mu Peeling heard this, her briefly hopeful heart immediately turned ice cold once again. At that moment, the explosions in the skies suddenly became far more dense and winds began to continuously revolve, forming a huge ring of white wind around Han Li and the Marquis. Lu Luo yelped in surprise as an odd expression appeared on his face. "I can't believe it. Junior martial brother isn't losing." Mu Peeling was overjoyed by this and thought to ask something more, but a series of blinding white lights filled the skies. Soon after, claps of thunder rang out and the ring of wind surrounding them ruptured, sweeping up their surroundings in a violent windstorm. 100 meters away from them, the others revealed shock as they saw the overbearing squalls arrive towards them. "Not good," Lu Luo softly shouted. His figure blurred and blocked Mu Peeling. At the same time, he crossed his hands, summoning a blue light barrier in front of them. In that short moment, the fierce squall had already arrived at their barrier. Strange creaks continuously sounded out from the wind as if it were a heavy strike. An instant later, there was a deep indentation left behind on the barrier. Fortunately, the winds quickly scattered and a majority swept past them. The light barrier was soon restored to its original form. As for Marquis Nanlong's group of soldier cultivators, they lifted their golden halberds in a disciplined manner, forming a huge barrier of golden light around them and the carriage. However, the golden light only lasted against the white gale for an instant before shattering. When the remaining gust swept through, the cultivators behind the barrier held their heads in their arms and miserably screamed. Blood bled from every opening of their head in a frightening display. Only the two concubines were safe due to the carriage's protective restrictions. However, their faces were pale from fear. Mu Peeling felt her blood turn cold at the sight as she turned her gaze once more to Han Li, mesmerized. At that moment, Marquis Nanlong coldly snorted. A ball of golden light suddenly appeared and burst into countless streaks of golden light that quickly surrounded his servants. When the golden light appeared, his servants ceased their screams and stood firm once more. Although they appeared panic-stricken, they no longer seemed to be in pain. Having saved his subordinates, Marquis Nanlong turned his gaze towards Han Li and revealed bewilderment as if he couldn't believe that Han Li's spiritual sense could rival his own. In that previous bout, he had released a majority of his spiritual sense, but Han Li was able to effortlessly continue. From how relaxed he appeared, it seemed possible that Han Li's spiritual sense was actually stronger than his own. Marquis Nanlong's contempt had long disappeared and his heart wavered. At that moment, Han Li widely smiled at him and casually said, "Shall we stop the contest? I fear I might not last if this continues." With some further thought, Marquis Nanlong's expression relaxed and he said, "Ha ha! Fellow Daoist Han is far too modest. Let alone your techniques, but even your spiritual sense isn't inferior to my own in the slightest. Let us drop the contest, else we may end up injured." When Han Li heard this, he inwardly sighed despite the smile on his face. Although he wasn't willing to truly fight against this Marquis Nanlong, from what he had experienced in the contest, Han Li should prove an equal match at the very least. However, their recent struggle had caused the Marquis to view Han Li with some apprehension and he didn't dare to treat him lightly. Moreover, his spiritual sense was strong enough to meet his conditions. He had a request to make of Han Li. Marquis South Dragon strangely smiled at Han Li and stealthily sent him a voice transmission. "Since fellow Daoist Han's spiritual sense is on par with mine, I will tell you the true reason for the contest. It is as fellow Daoist guest, I had a different objective in mind for forcibly testing your spiritual sense. However, this matter is quite important and it is inconvenient to speak of it here. The jade slip contains a map. On the 4th day of the trade meet, there will be a gathering of cultivators as indicated. I will introduce you to these fellow Daoists, and we will discuss a matter that will benefit us all." Afterwards, he stroked his storage pouch and took out an exquisite jade slip that he tossed towards Han Li without any regard to Lu Luo. When Han Li saw this, he immediately extended his hand and took the jade slip. After examining the Marquis for a moment, he placed the jade slip into his storage pouch for later. The Marquis chuckled at the sight and then descended towards his carriage in a sphere of golden light. The carriage's golden light then appeared once more and he quickly made his way towards Soaring Heaven City with his escort. The Marquis seemed to ignore Lu Luo in his departure. While other nascent soul cultivators would feel indignant and dissatisfied by this treatment, Lu Luo knew of the Marquis' eccentric personality and could only smile wryly. At that moment, Han Li descended towards Elder Lu and Mu Peeling. "My lord, are you all right?" When she saw Han Li return, Mu Peeling greeted him with a flushed face as she stared at him with bright eyes. Although her lord had contested with Marquis Nanlong for only a moment, that recent display of mighty ability had greatly shaken her heart. She felt somewhat more appreciative of her position by his side and faintly developed a sense of security from him. "It was nothing, merely a bit of effort," Han Li calmly said. Her sudden display of concern had made his heart throb. Lu Luo looked at Han Li for a long while with admiration before beaming and said, "Junior Martial Brother, you keep your secrets well. You made me worry for nothing." Han Li calmly said, "I never meant to conceal this from my 2 senior martial brothers, it's just that you haven't ever asked me about it, but let's hurry for now. Those spiritual sense gales will certainly draw the attention of many cultivators." Lu Luo instantly agreed, "That's right. It would be troublesome if this were widely spread. Let's quickly head to Soaring Sky City." Chapter 677, Meeting the Boy. Han Li stood on the side of a mountain and glanced at the huge city walls several kilometers away. He softly said, "This is Soaring Heaven's mountain." Lu Luo stood at Han Li's side and spoke with a similar expression. "Has Junior Martial Brother never seen such a large city before? The 9 Nations Union have expanded this city several times before reaching such a size. Although I wouldn't dare to say that this is the largest city in the Heavenly South, it definitely is among the top 5. The entire city is also made of huge stones from the same source." When Han Li heard this, he faintly smiled. What city could possibly best Scattered Star Sea's Heavenly Star City? Now that city was truly gargantuan existence. Although Soaring Heaven City was a huge city that spanned over 50 kilometers, it still wasn't something that could be compared to Heavenly Star City. Han Li didn't care much of it, but Mu Piling was clearly amazed by the sight of this stone city. Nevertheless, we will have to approach Soaring Heaven City on foot. How troublesome. Lu Luo shook his hand and spoke with slight dissatisfaction. Han Li pursed his lips and replied, "The Nine Nations Union can't help it. There are far too many high-grade cultivators that have come. They would have no way of managing the city if they were to come by air. Fortunately, these restrictions are merely superficial against nascent soul cultivators like us. If we truly wished to fly, these restrictions couldn't do anything to us." I didn't expect for Junior Marshal Brother to be so open-minded. All right, let's go. The sooner we get to the city, the more profit will be had. Ever since Han Li's bout with Marquis Nanlong, Senior Marshal Brother Lu had treated Han Li in a far greater familiarity. Han Li nodded with a smile, and the three began to walk towards the city gate in stride. Because they were in the vicinity of Soaring Heaven City, there were vast crowds entering the city from every direction. Han Li and Lu Luo already concealed their cultivation as this didn't wish to cause a disturbance. They entered the crowd under the guise of Foundation Establishment cultivators and made way towards the city gate. Although there were protectors from the Nine Nations Union, they didn't discover anything amiss from Han Li or Lu Luo. After they entered Soaring Heaven City, they spotted orderly rows of stone buildings. There were stone streets of varying length between each of the stone buildings, forming what seemed to be a crowded web-like pathway. Since Lu Luo had been at Soaring Heavens in the past, he suggested, "Let's first get a fixed residence. There is no need for us to barge into any inns. There are distinguished pavilions that are specialized for nascent soul cultivators like us. We'll be heading there directly." Han Li didn't raise any objects and followed after Elder Lu with Mu Piling in tow. Lu Luo ended up bringing to the two towards a corner of the city. A short moment later, the three passed through many roads before arriving in front of a white light barrier. Behind the light barrier laid many pavilions that were simply designed but elegant nonetheless. There were other cultivators outside the light barrier, peering inside with expressions of admiration and reverence. However, they didn't dare to stay for too long and each of them eventually hurried on their way. The restrictions here are only something a nascent soul cultivator can dissolve. Lu Luo pressed his hand against the light barrier and blue light flickered from his palm. With a whoosh, the white light barrier formed a hole from where Lu Luo's palm had touched it. He then flew inside with a blur, followed by the light barrier closing at an inconceivable speed. After a moment of surprise, Han Li opened his mouth and spouted out a mist of azure light. The white light barrier flickered upon contact with the azure light and a 3-meter large hole immediately shattered. Han Li grabbed onto Mu Piling's waist and quickly brought her through the light barrier. Mu Piling blushed from being in Han Li's embrace and felt a peculiar emotion in her heart. Lu Luo appeared amazed at how easily Han Li had broken through the barrier, but his calm soon returned. Lu Luo pointed to a few of the pavilions with a smile and said, "These pavilions are for the use for any nascent soul cultivators and any disciples they may bring. They may be chosen at will, but the light restrictions surrounding the pavilions illustrate whether or not they are already occupied. However, not all nascent soul cultivators are willing to use this place. There are a few eccentrics that are willing to stay outside the city or at inns." As expected, a small portion of the pavilions were already glowing with light restrictions. Lu Luo pointed to 2 pavilions a couple hundred of meters away and proposed, "Junior Marshal Brother, let's pick those neighboring pavilions. If anything happens, it will be best if we look after each other." After examining them for a moment, Han Li replied, "Let's do as you say." Just as Lu Luo was about to say something else, the white-yellow light barrier covering another pavilion suddenly opened to reveal a small figure. When this person swept past Han Li and Luo Lu, they astonishedly said, "Yi, is it not Brother Lu? I didn't expect for you to arrive so early." Han Li hastily peered in the speaker's direction. This person was a child with delicate, flawless skin. He was the child fire dragon that Han Li previous saw at the sacred area of the 3 sects. Once he finished speaking, his bright eyes turned towards Han Li and Mu Piling, resulting in an expression of astonishment. With his vast memory, he was able to recall them both being among the finalists of the last sword trial assembly. However, Han Li was now only using a superficial cultivation concealment technique, something ineffective against cultivators of the same grade. After a moment of surprise, the boy revealed an expression of understanding. Lu Luo quickly smiled upon seeing him. It seemed their relationship was quite good. He. So it turned out to be fellow Daoist Lan. How are we early? You obviously rushed over here. Ah, that's right. This is our newly joined elder Han. Junior Marshal Brother Han. I believe you've met Brother Lan once before. There should be no further need for introductions. When the child fire dragon heard this, he wryly smiled and said, so it is true that fellow Daoist Han entered the Drifting Cloud sect as a new elder. My eyes were truly awry that day. Having heard this, Han Li offered a cursory explanation with a smile. I had merely heard of the grand reputation of the sacred spirit well tree and wished to enter the sacred area to take a look. I sincerely hope fellow Daoist Lan didn't take offense. Since fellow Daoist is now an elder of the Drifting Cloud sect, this matter need not be mentioned further. However, you two have arrived quite timely. I happen to be meeting a few friendly acquaintances of mine at the Crystal Dragon Pavilion for a small-scale trade. How about you two fellow Daoists come and take a look? Perhaps you might find something you like. The child fire dragon seemed to have a straightforward temperament to have invited them with a beckon. Lu Luo joyously said, to think there would be an exchange so soon. TCH. We've definitely come at a good time. He then hastily turned towards Han Li with his expression quickly turning solemn. Junior Marshal Brother Han, there aren't many exchanges that occur between nascent soul cultivators. We must go, else we could miss some good items. Han Li calmly smiled and said, then let us follow Senior Marshal Brother Lan. After Han Li and Luo Lu arranged restrictions outside their pavilions, they followed the child fire dragon out of the residential area. Han Li had instructed Mu Peeling to stay inside the pavilion for the time being. The child fire dragon explained in a clear voice, the Crystal Dragon Pavilion was opened by a good friend of mine from the Nine Nations Union. My good friend has made a wide range of connections, acquainting himself with those from every power. As such, he was able to form this trade meeting. However, in order to prevent any unnecessary trouble, all of those attending will be concealing their true appearances. Lu Luo's heart stirred and he spoke with amazement. Brother Lan seems to be talking of Daoist Heaven Crystal. However, I recall that Daoist Heaven Crystal isn't fond of business matters. Did he truly take the initiative to hold this trade meeting? The child fire dragon chuckled and said, I didn't expect that fellow Daoist Lu would know of my old friend's reputation. That's right, while my old friend isn't fond of such inconvenience, there are a few required materials that he had been searching for. I reckon he took the initiative to start this trade meet in order to find them. Lu Luo nodded his head. Oh, if that's the case, it does seem quite likely. As Han Li listened to the two, his expression remained as always. The three walked towards a pure white pavilion ahead of them. It was 3 stories tall and grew more narrow towards the top. There was a silver sign that hung from the building with the words Crystal Dragon Pavilion. Chapter 678, Nascent Soul Meeting. It's right here. Fellow Daoists, let's go in. The child fire dragon smiled at the two and walked towards the Crystal Dragon Pavilion with a swagger. Once they approached the pavilion's large gate, Han Li casually took a look inside and revealed surprise. The interior appeared to be that of an ordinary restaurant. Not only was it full of guests that were eating and drinking, there were also several waiters that were scurrying between tables with dishes in hand. The scents of fine wine and food were accompanied with the clanging of cups. After they pushed open the gates, they saw a foot-long wooden plate hung at the side. This building is taken. Outsiders are prohibited were written on it in pitch-black words. That old ghost Heaven Crystal is still playing around with silly illusion techniques. Really? After muttering those words, the child fire dragon paid no more attention to it and walked in with a stride. When Han Li heard this, his heart stirred and he swept his spiritual sense past the floor. He soon revealed a strange expression, but he continued inside. Once they passed the gate, the guests, waiters, scents and sounds, all disappeared like the pop of a bubble. Han Li casually swept his gaze at the scene and saw that all that remained was a grey mist surrounding the building. There was merely an old-fashioned table at the center of the room with a copper lamp that was lit with a grey-robed daoist with an amiable face sitting behind the lamp. He appeared to be 60 years of age and was glancing at the three with a smile. I didn't expect that Brother Lan would arrive, let alone bring guests. This old daoist's eyes are rather poor. It seems as if I've never seen this azure-robed fellow daoist before. Could he have recently entered nascent soul? The grey-robed daoist smiled and cordially beckoned to them. His intimate manners unconsciously aroused in a good impression amongst them. The child fire dragon returned the smile, but he spoke with an unexpectedly harsh tone. Brother Heaven Crystal, I've brought 2 uninvited guests. Surely you won't refuse them. Why would I do that? This place welcomes all fellow Taoists. Besides, I am acquainted with fellow daoist Lu. It is only... The old daoist's gaze hovered towards Han Li. Han Li took a step forward and saluted him. I am the Drifting Cloud Sex Han Li, a newly ascended nascent soul cultivator. I hope Daoist Heaven Crystal can provide me some guidance in the future. Daoist Heaven Crystal pleasantly smiled and said, so it turned out to be a sect member of fellow Daoist Lu. From his young age, he's certain to have boundless prospects. Enough, old friend. The others should be arriving soon. We'll be going upstairs. From his direct words, it seemed the child fire dragon had a rather deep friendship with him. Daoist Heaven Crystal sighed. Brother Lan is still so impatient. Almost everyone has already arrived. I'm sure a few of the more impatient ones have already started trading as well. Here are 2 black spirit masks for those fellow Taoists. Brother Lan, do you need one? He then flipped his hands and summoned 2 black wood masks into his hands with a flash of white light. Talisman characters appeared on their surface. The child fire dragon's cheeks bulged as if he were annoyed. He snorted and said, of course you should know that with my stature, regardless of any illusions I use, I cannot conceal myself. Of course. Please come up. This old man will join you in a bit. Daoist Heaven Crystal casually smiled and tossed the masks to Han Li and Lu Luo. At that same time, a white streak of light showed towards the mist behind him. The mist disappeared and revealed stairs of glittering light that led to the 2nd floor. Without any further courtesies, the child fire dragon wordlessly walked around the table and climbed to the 2nd floor. Lu Luo and Han Li saluted the old daoist before following him up the stairs. Once Han Li discovered that his mask was exactly the same as Lu Luo's, he wore it without any reservations and climbed up the stairs. The mask was cold to the touch and soft. To Han Li's surprise, it was so comfortable, it felt as if it wasn't even there. He turned his head to look at Lu Luo and saw that he also wore the mask, turning his face into an icy wooden carving. Han Li faintly smiled at the sight. At that moment, the 3 had already arrived on the 2nd floor. It was well lit with over 100 fist-sized moonstones embedded in the ceiling and walls. But what surprised Han Li most of all was that the 2nd floor was several times more spacious than the 1st floor. It appeared far narrower than the 1st floor from the outside. Of course, the 2nd floor wasn't empty. There were tables lined up against the walls with chairs accompanying each of them. There were various clothed cultivators sitting in many of them. From their bodies and hair, it appeared there were men and women of all ages. When Han Li and company arrived, countless cold glints swept past them. Many of them clearly recognized the unconcealed child fire dragon. The expressions of their eyes varied anywhere from goodwill, hatred, and indifferences. There were a few gazes that even carried unconcealable killing intent, suggesting they formed animosity in the past. The child fire dragon was unconcerned with these gazes and led Han Li and Luo Lu to an empty table. At that moment, Han Li glanced at the others. Because of the mask's concealment, those with formidable spiritual sense such as Han Li were unable to clearly see their faces. However, there was no doubt that each of them were nascent soul cultivators from their spiritual chi fluctuations. There were even 2 among them that were at mid-nascent soul stage, but they were sitting alone and none dared to rashly sit next to them. What appeared to be a small pavilion held at least 20 nascent soul cultivators, something that was rarely heard of. Before this, Han Li hadn't seen so many nascent soul eccentrics in one place. It seemed one's cultivation had to be at a similar level to encounter so many cultivators. Han Li's gaze flickered, and it suddenly focused at a particular corner of the floor. As Daoist Heaven Crystal had mentioned, there were already a few impatient cultivators that had gathered around a table. Their lips were moving from voice transmissions, and they occasionally exchanged jade boxes and small bottles in some small-scale trades. However, most of the other cultivators were sitting with their eyes closed in meditation. They were waiting for everyone to gather before they started trading. It seemed what was being traded prematurely wasn't anything particularly valuable. Also, in what seemed to be an attempt to avoid being recognized, many of the cultivators were completely silent, and only spoke to one another through voice transmissions. The second floor of the pavilion had completely maintained its silence in a bizarre and stifling manner. The child fire dragon hadn't bothered to wear a mask, attracting many gazes as a result. Nevertheless, there were none who took the initiative to reveal themselves to him. Sitting right across from Han Li and company was an extremely fat man, who also wore no mask. His waist was 4 times thicker than the average person and even caused his chair to slightly deform. Regardless, this person didn't seem to mind in the last. When he saw Han Li glance at him, he shot a beaming smile in his direction. However, the many layers of fat on his face made it difficult to accept his kind intentions. Sitting at the plump man's side was a very shapely female cultivator. Although she wore a mask, her eyes were vivid and captivating. Still, everyone present was certain of the cunning of those around them, and none paid any particular attention to the woman's charm. When Han Li saw this, he heard Lu Luo's voice transmission, "Junior Marshal Brother Han, be careful. That fatty may seem harmless, but together with the woman at his side, they are the Devil Dao Harmonious Bond Sex Flesh Rouge Devils. With their secret pair cultivation techniques, they are able to contend against even mid-nascent soul cultivators. Avoid provoking them, they are incredibly difficult to deal with." When Han Li heard this, he felt his heart tremble and he immediately added their names onto a long list of those he should be wary of. After he finished observing the characteristics of all others in the room, he closed his eyes and silently meditated. Over the period of a long while, several masked nascent soul cultivators continuously entered the room. Daoist Heaven Crystal was the last to enter, drawing the eyes of all the cultivators present. He directly walked to the center of the floor and casually waved his arm, summoning a table and chair towards him with white light. He then smiled and said, "Everyone should have already arrived. If nobody has anything else to say, let us start the trade meet." Chapter 679, Scarlet Essence Herb. Daoist Heaven Crystal is far too polite. But since I've grown rather impatient, how about I start off? An embroidered-robed cultivator said with a smile. He, since fellow Daoist insists, so be it. Daoist Heaven Crystal smiled and casually withdrew a few steps, inviting the embroidered-robed cultivators to step forward. There were no rules given for the trade meeting as the cultivators that were present were rather experienced. Since Brother Heaven Crystal agreed, this old man won't refuse. The embroidered-robed cultivator boldly stood up and saluted the cultivators in the room. He lightly slapped the storage pouch at his waist and summoned a palm-sized wooden box into his hand with a flash of red light. The wooden box was refined from a fantastical wood of some sort. Red flames faintly flickered from its dark green body with 2 intersecting gold and silver restriction talismans laid over it. This mysterious box attracted the various gazes of those in the room. These experienced cultivators naturally knew that this box was certain to hold a precious item. Seeing this treasure being exchanged at the very start of the trade meet was cause for excitement. The embroidered-robed man swept his eyes past the crowd in a display of pride. He then pointed at the 2 talismans on the box, and the box opened by itself once the talismans flew off. Suddenly, a glowing red spirit mushroom slowly floated from the box. The spirit mushroom was only a few inches large, but the scorching heat that it emitted and its sparkling exterior revealed it to be a divine object, not to mention the red mists that spiraled around it. As Han Li was dumbstruck from the sight of it, there were already others calling out its name. A black-clothed sighed and muttered, "Scarlet Essence Mushroom. A 3,000-year-old scarlet essence mushroom. It only grows where lava flows." It cannot ordinarily be spotted, let alone acquired. Fellow Daoist must be truly skilled. It was unknown whether he was envious or impressed by his tone. An uproar was raised among the cultivators. They even began to talk amongst one another. Scarlet essence mushroom? This is one of the Icefire spirit mushrooms. It is clearly worthy of its reputation from the impressive fire spirit chi that it's emitting. When the embroidered-robed man heard that its name was mentioned, his eyes betrayed surprise, but he soon recollected himself and said, "Since fellow Daoist has recognized this item, there is no further need for me to speak of it. It is a 3,000-year-old scarlet essence mushroom, a top-grade material for fire attribute medicine pills. I will exchange it for either 100,000 spirit stones or its equivalent in earth attribute materials." 100,000 spirit stones. Han Li was astonished and his heart began to stir. This price was far lower than Han Li expected. This mushroom wasn't something that could be compared to high-grade demon cores. It was on the level of the 9-curl spirit ginseng itself. Not mentioning his many precious treasures, Han Li had acquired several hundred thousands of spirit stones from the storage pouches that he looted. The disciple of Archsaint 6 Dao in particular possessed 3,000 mid-grade spirit stones, enriching Han Li greatly. It was a sum that was comparable to the entire wealth of many nascent soul cultivators. Of course, these spirit stones were far inferior in value to spirit tools, magic treasures, and even ancient treasures. After all, there were precious items that couldn't be bought. If he could spend all of his spirit stones on ancient treasures similar to his flower basket and small bell, he would do so without question. Just as Han Li mused about this, other cultivators were also tempted by the item. Several cultivators promptly stepped forward and sent a few voice transmissions to the embroidered-robed cultivators. Afterwards, they took out several items for the cultivator to see. While the others couldn't see these items clearly, the embroidered-robed cultivator bluntly refused them each with a single glance, causing them to resentfully withdraw. "Is there anyone else?" This 3,000-year-old scarlet essence mushroom was acquired over 6 years of immense toil, and it is being sold for only 100,000 spirit stones. It definitely isn't expensive. However, I also wish that this item may be exchanged for some suitable earth attribute materials. Even if it is somewhat inferior in comparison, I will still take it. But if there is too much of a difference in value and you merely wish to take advantage of me, don't bother wasting my time. As if truly wishing to trade with the item in his hand, he grew impatient from seeing that no one was stepping forward. Han Li swept his gaze past the other cultivators and noticed that many wore expression of greed, yet none of them stepped forward. It seemed that they didn't believe the price to be too expensive, but that they didn't have anything suitable to trade for it. Even the child fire dragon wore a face of regret. He cultivated a genuine fire attribute cultivation technique, and it would prove incredibly useful towards him. Seeing that there were no further offers, he helplessly grasped the lid of the wooden box and was about to close it when Han Li sent him a voice transmission. "Don't be so hasty, fellow Daoist. Would you be interested in an earth attribute demon core?" The embroidered-robed man stopped upon hearing Han Li. With slight surprise, he replied to Han Li through voice transmission, "You have demon cores? However, my scarlet essence mushroom must be exchanged for a grade 7 demon core or several grade 6 demon cores at the very least." Han Li pondered after receiving his reply. He still had a few demon beast cores left over from refining his medicine pills. Since they came from particularly rare demon beasts, he kept them in case they may have other uses, such as now. The spirit mushroom could be further matured through use of his green liquid, unlike his demon cores. As for their prices, it was somewhat hard to say. In the scattered star seas, grade 7 demon cores were extremely precious, but far less valuable than a scarlet essence mushroom. However, this was different in the heavenly south. Not to mention grade 6 demon cores, even grade 5 demon cores were rarely seen items. There were few places in the heavenly south where high-grade demon beasts dwelled. In this case, a grade 7 demon core was a fair trade for a 3,000-year-old scarlet essence mushroom. Having came to a decision, Han Li stood up and walked towards the embroidered-robed cultivator. This came as a surprise to the child fire dragon and Lu Luo, and they looked at him with amazement. Han Li took several steps towards the embroidered-robed cultivator and summoned a jade box with a flip of his hand. He then tossed it to cultivator without saying a single word. The embroidered-robed cultivator calmly caught the box and opened it. After carefully examining it for a long while, his gaze revealed delight. "We've reached a deal." He beckoned to the floating mushroom and sealed it before handing it over to Han Li. At that same moment, he swiftly placed the jade box into his own storage pouch. Han Li nodded his head and placed the wooden box into his own storage pouch before turning to his original position. Lu Luo and the child fire dragon were both completely astounded, but the two tactfully avoided asking Han Li any questions and simply sent him a few words of congratulations. Han Li accepted their words with a tranquil expression. Nevertheless, Han Li could already feel the many gazes of the seated cultivators examining him once more. Obviously, being able to afford the scarlet essence mushroom had attracted much interest. However, Han Li was unconcerned. With his current abilities, he had no problems escaping from anything short of a late nascent soul cultivator. "Alright, since this fellow Daoist has finished trading, let's have the next fellow Daoist head up." Daoist Heaven Crystal beamingly smiled at a female cultivator sitting nearby the embroidered-robed man and suggested, "How about you?" The green-robed woman gracefully replied, "Of course, I shall be presenting my treasures next." She stood up and slowly said, "I didn't have such a good opportunity to acquire as rare a treasure as the previous fellow Daoist. However, I am proficient in tool refinement techniques, and have refined an immortal binding ring that has never been bonded. So long as someone perform the rites to accept a master, one will be able to make full use of its abilities. I don't mean to boast, but while this treasure was created with common materials, its might is quite formidable. It is remarkably effective at both restraining enemies and protecting its user." With a flutter of her sleeve, a fine white ring flew out and began to fluctuate in size and flicker with light. Without speaking any further, she pointed to the ring and it suddenly trembled before expanding to 3 meters in length. The walls of the ring were as thick as an arm and emitted silver talisman characters along with an astonishing spiritual qi. Chapter 680, Devilfall Valley. Since this ring has yet to recognize a master, I am unable to display its full abilities. Of course, you should all know it comes at quite a price. I intend on trading this immortal binding ring for a bottle of nascent soul level cultivation pills. If you're interested in giving an offer, I'll be taking a look at them. Although cultivators present each had their own magic treasures, nurturing multiple magic treasures with differing abilities wasn't unheard of. Furthermore, this magic treasure was masterless, so it can be given to disciples. Of course, magic treasures that were created by nascent soul cultivators were far stronger than those created by core formation cultivators. A majority of cultivators also weren't experts in tool refinement, especially so with nascent soul cultivators. Since an expertly refined treasure appeared before them, many grew tempted and wished to trade for them. The woman selected one of the bottles of medicine pills offered to her and smoothly concluded the transaction. Although this immortal binding ring was far less valuable than the scarlet essence mushroom, it was also much easier to trade for. The next cultivator stood up before Daoist Heaven Crystal called out to him, "I am offering Starsteel Sand for trade. It can be used for..." The trade meeting went smoothly with each nascent soul cultivators taking out their own items, each an undoubtable rarity. They were far beyond what Han Li had previously seen offered at markets, and couldn't be afforded even with the entirety of a common core formation cultivator's wealth. When a cultivator's turn arrived, they naturally took out an item suitable for a cultivator of their rank. But of course, not everyone made a successful trade. There were a few items that were too unfamiliar, along with those that were desirable but had an unfulfillable price. Nevertheless, these nascent soul cultivators were each brimming with experience. There was no possibility of trades with large disparities in value. The child fire dragon and Lu Luo were both in front of Han Li and each took out their own items first. The child fire dragon took out a bowl-sized, tri-colored flower, an ingredient for pill refinement. Although it couldn't be compared with the scarlet essence mushroom, it was still a rare item. However, since there was no one that possessed the item he was looking for, the poison mark wood, he could only sit back down with disappointment. As for Lu Luo, he ended up with a rather successful transaction. He traded a bottle of something Han Li had never heard of before, spirit herb extract, for a small fire-red sword that hadn't yet recognized a master. It was unknown who he was giving it to, as there was no possibility of refining it for himself given his age. With Lu Luo's successful transaction came Han Li's turn. Because he successfully traded for the embroidered-robed cultivator's scarlet essence mushroom at the beginning, there were many that were particularly focusing their attention on Han Li. Han Li calmly stood up and took out 2 white jade boxes that he had previously prepared. I have grade 6 water attribute demon cores and 2 stalks of 1,000-year-old spirit herbs. I will exchange them for a piece of auric essence. But if I can't, I will trade one of the boxes for the whereabouts of auric essence as well. Once Han Li said this, his hands trembled and azure light flickered. The 2 jade boxes opened at the same time. A red and blue demon core, and 2 glistening, jade-green spirit herbs were revealed. Auric essence. All cultivators around them revealed an odd expression. While these demon cores and the 1,000-year spirit herbs were precious, there was still a great difference in value in between them. If he were to truly trade for them, it was quite likely he would only be able to pay for only a small iota of it, nowhere near enough. But if it were information on the whereabouts of auric essence, a grade 6 demon core or a stalk of 1,000-year-old spirit herbs was rather generous. After all, everyone knew that information alone wasn't anywhere near as valuable as having the item on hand. Ancient cultivator ruins and areas of value were known by many, but these areas were extremely dangerous to the point where vastly skilled cultivators would find it difficult to escape even with grave injuries. The most notable example of this would be the Devil Fall Valley at the center of the heavenly South continent. Legend has it that it was an ancient battlefield from the time of antiquity where any fantastical restrictions were placed by the devilish cultivators of long past. Perhaps due to the vast damage from the climax of the battle, there were even slim crevices in space itself, destabilizing the entire valley. As a result, the ancient battle had ended in mutual destruction. The spatial tears and ancient restrictions caused the ancient battlefield to be extremely dangerous. Over the countless years, it was unknown just how many overly confident entered those ruins seeking treasures only to never return. Any treasures these cultivators may have acquired were always left behind in the valley. After nearly 10,000 years of this continued, no other cultivators dared to try their luck, earning Devil Fall Valley the title as deadliest region in the heavenly South. Despite the knowledge of many treasures contained deep within the valley, they would only exist in dreams as none dared to seek their own death. In any case, auric essence wasn't something that was commonly known about. As such, each of the cultivators merely glanced at Han Li without sending him any voice transmissions. When Han Li saw this, he grew somewhat disappointed. In order to hide his wealth, he didn't take out any of his more precious items, preventing him from trading for anything he needed. Nevertheless, he was quite disappointed that nobody knew of any related information, despite the many nascent soul cultivators present. He inwardly sighed and swept his gaze past the group of cultivators. He unconsciously frowned before sitting down with an odd expression flickering from his eyes. The following cultivator immediately took out black tool refinement materials and began to introduce it. Han Li half-heartedly listened to the cultivator and closed his eyes. If Han Li wasn't mistaken, Daoist Heaven Crystal betrayed hesitation from his eyes despite his calm expression. While Daoist Heaven Crystal might not possess any auric essence, it seemed he did have information on where he could get some. Without much thought, Han Li immediately came to a decision. But as one possessing patient temperament, he left the matter alone for now and simply feigned ignorance. He was confident that with just this clue, he will eventually have an opportunity to acquire the information he needed. A long while later, the last cultivator finished exchanging for the materials they required. Daoist Heaven Crystal then walked to the center of the floor and smiled. "Fellow Taoists, it appears a majority of you had traded for the materials that you required. Even if you didn't, it doesn't matter. Our little gathering is merely a tenth of the nascent soul cultivators that have arrived at the city. There will be more opportunities to come. While I can't say this for anybody else, I may be holding an even larger trade meet. I hope you fellow Taoists will be able to participate in it. But before we come to a close, I also have a few items I wish to put up for trade." Once the old Daoist finished speaking, his hands began to sparkle with white light and he summoned even items from his storage pouch, filling the table. When the other cultivators saw the items in the table, they were left amazed. Once Han Li saw these items, his expression also greatly changed. 8 varying monstrous beast puppets were arranged on the table, including a white wolf, azure pythons, and even a red bull. Although these items were entirely still, they contained astonishing spiritual chi equivalent to early core formation cultivators. They were far more powerful than the huge ape puppets in Han Li's possession, and they weren't recorded in Han Li's puppet sutras either, much to Han Li's bewilderment. Could this person also be a cultivator of the 1,000 Bamboo School? But the 1,000 Bamboo School shouldn't have any cultivators at nascent soul stage. Could there be another group cultivating their own style of puppets? As Han Li's mind stirred, he couldn't help but gaze at these puppets, hoping to make out any peculiarities. But before he could do so, the fatty from the Harmonious Bond sect smiled and yelped, "Fellow Daoist Heaven Crystal, since when did you start cultivating puppet techniques? Did you plan on abandoning your crystal light arts? If that's the case, you have my wholehearted admiration." Daoist Heaven Crystal grinned. "Brother Jew jests. With my weary body, how could I possibly change my cultivation art? These puppets were merely something I found in some ruins with some other fellow Taoists. As am I embarrassingly short on money as of current, I must use them for trade. Although their might isn't great, they will be particularly effective in certain situations."